She is a retired English professor, and she writes middle grade and young adult novels. And although she hasn't published a novel yet, she really is a well-respected teacher and writer in the writing community. So I'm really pleased to be able to have her here today to talk about writing for tweens and teens. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Judy.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Elizabeth, and welcome everyone to Writing for Tweens and Teens. In all the time I taught fiction at Sinclair, most of my students wanted to learn to write for adults. And though I've also enjoyed writing for adults, over the years I've found that writing for younger readers gives me more satisfaction. I grew up in a household that lacked money but valued books. And my father, who taught me to read before I went to school, took me to the library every week until I was old enough to go by myself. I entered the worlds of Stuart Little, The Secret Garden, and the Nancy Drew mysteries. And perhaps because I was an only child, I loved Louisa May Alcott's 8 Cousins even more than Little Women, because Rose was an only child too, and her 7 boy cousins brought noise and energy into her life. My first goal in this talk is to give you information about both the similarities and differences of writing fiction for tweens and teens. My second is to show how such craft and thematic elements as character, plot, structure, home, and romance operate in middle grade and young adult fiction. And my third is to remind you to enjoy the writing, whether it leads to publication or not. I think the similarities in writing for tweens and teens are pretty obvious. Each group wants an experience that affects them. They may want to enter a story world that takes them out of present time and place and lets them explore a region that no longer exists or has never existed. Or they may want to see how other kids handle the problems of the world they're familiar with. Either way, they want to safely explore a life that isn't theirs, and they want to feel that the reading experience matters. The differences depend largely upon their age, and their age determines how they see the world and where they see it from. Okay, throughout this talk, I'm going to use information from 3 books that cover these differences and also offer much more. Deborah Halverson's Writing Young Adult Fiction for Dummies, Cheryl B. Klein's The Magic Words, Writing Great Books for Children and Young Adults, and Mary Cole's Writing Irresistible Kid Lit. In libraries and bookstores, middle grade books are shelved in the children's section, and young adult books are in an area separate from it. So since people looking at middle grade books will not see the young adult titles and vice versa, you need to carefully consider where you think your book belongs. And there are 3 very straightforward things to think about as you mentally locate your book. These distinctions are the age of your main character, the length of your manuscript, and the probable purchaser of your book. Young readers usually want to read about characters who are at least as old as they are, and often prefer those who are a little older. So reader age tends to determine character age. A 12-year-old isn't likely to choose to read about a 10-year-old. Klein, the editorial director at Lee & Low Books and an author herself, says flatly that the first thing a publisher looks at to determine where a book fits is the physical age of the main character. If he is 12 or younger, the book belongs in middle grade. 13 or older, it's young adult. And if the protagonist is older than 18 or in college, conventional wisdom holds that the novel should be adult fiction. Cole, a freelance editor who used to be a children's book agent at Andrea Brown, says make your middle grade characters firmly 13 or older. You can see on this slide that the authors of all 3 books generally agree about appropriate word lengths for middle grade novels, although Although Halverson, who spent 10 years as an editor at Harcourt Children's Books and is now an author, freelance editor, and writing instructor, offers lower numbers than the others. I mention that to remind you that none of the rules I can suggest are absolute, but they can at least give you some guidelines for what agents and editors will see as appropriate. Young adult novels will be longer than middle grade, and you've probably noticed that Klein suggests much longer counts for fantasy than for realistic fiction. That's because fantasy and science fiction, and sometimes historical fiction, require greater world building. Readers of realistic fiction are already familiar with the world they live in. They will need to be oriented to the particular part of the world the book is about, but they know that people can't fly without an airplane, and where the sun is, and all the other things about Earth that we take for granted. In fantasy, they'll need more information. When it comes to buying books, the person most likely to buy a middle grade book is a parent or older relative of the child. Since typical middle grade readers are between 8 and 12 years old, their parents often make the decision about whether particular books are appropriate for them to read, and that authority has a definite effect on the content of books for that age group. In the context of fiction for middle grade or young adult readers, the word content has a very specific meaning. In the children's book market, this word refers to anything edgy: swearing, sex, drugs, alcohol, violence, gangs, etc. And while content in this sense is acceptable, often encouraged in young adult books, it is strongly discouraged by the gatekeepers of middle grade books: parents, teachers, booksellers, and librarians. So if you're writing middle grade fiction, you should know that if you include those kinds of language or subject matter, especially for the younger end of the age range, you're more likely to be challenged. As an extreme example, Cole mentions the online outrage over Susan Patron's inclusion of the word scrotum on the first page of her 2007 Newbery Medal book, The Higher Power of Lucky. But what if you're writing a middle grade book that requires edgy content? If that's the case, Cole suggests that it should be associated with a secondary character. A friend of mine, for instance, is writing a book that necessarily involves drug addiction, but the addict is the main character's college-age brother, not the much younger protagonist. If my friend were writing a young adult novel, she would have much greater leeway. Edgy content is common in young adult books, and writing about a 16 or 17-year-old character with a drug problem would be acceptable. And in this case, the reader and the buyer may be the same person. An important element of subject matter in both middle grade and young adult novels may be romance, but for middle grade books, it needs to be innocent: a growing awareness of another person, an arm around a shoulder, a kiss. In young adult novels, the writer can pretty much use any thoughts or behavior that fit with the overall tone of the story. Both Cole and Klein point out that middle grade readers, boys or girls, are far more centered on home than young adult readers. They may be testing their independence, but they're still at home and family. Or if home is an unsafe or neglectful place, they may be trying to improve it or to find more protective shelter. Young adult readers, on the other hand, see independence as a major goal. Home still has a genuine effect on their lives, but they know they'll soon be leaving. They're close enough to adulthood now to want to explore the kinds of choices they'll need to make. As Klein says, YA protagonists are interested in the world beyond home: friends, romance and sex, independence, travel, the future. So those are some of the general similarities and differences we can find in middle grade and young adult books. I've chosen 5 books in each category to illustrate a few elements of craft and subject matter. Some of the books are set in the real world, some in fantasy worlds. As I discuss them, I'll first give a brief orientation to the 5 books in the category, showing the importance of home and whether the book takes place in a real world or a fantasy world, and what the main character's problem is. Then I'll go more specifically into the structure of each book and how the character solves the problem. The middle grade books I'll use to illustrate the differences are Because of Winn-Dixie by Kate DiCamillo, Wonder by R.J. Palacio, Small Spaces by Catherine Arden, Race to the Sun by Rebecca Roanhorse, and The Girl Who Drank the Moon by Kelly Barnhill. Both Because of Winn-Dixie and Wonder are realistic fiction. Small Spaces and Race to the Sun move out of real places in current time and into ghostly or mythical places that contain grave danger. The Girl Who Drank the Moon takes place entirely in a fantasy world. In all of them, home and family are vitally important, though home is not always conventional. In Winn-Dixie and Race to the Sun, home is lonely because Opal and Nijoni's mothers have long ago abandoned them. And in Small Spaces, Ollie's mother has died within the year. The family in Wonder is warm and loving, but Augie's physical appearance makes school a terrifying place for him. And in The Girl Who Drank the Moon, Luna's very loving family consists of a witch, a swamp monster, and a tiny dragon. All of these children have significant problems, and one of the most important things to remember about middle grade and young adult fiction is that child characters must solve their own problems. Adults can't do it for them. That means that the problems you give your characters need to be difficult but possible. Opal in Because of Winn-Dixie and Augie in Wonder are both 10 years old. Ollie in Small Spaces is almost 12. Nijoni in Race to the Sun and Luna in The Girl Who Drank the Moon are both 12. The differences between abilities, perspectives, and knowledge at age 10 and age 12 are pretty substantial. So it makes sense that Ollie's problem is loneliness and Augie's is fitting in at school. These are problems that face 12-year-olds too, of course, but they're ones that 10-year-olds can do something about. The 3 other books with 11 and 12-year-old characters all have fantasy elements, and they require the characters to do things that would be less believable if they were younger. In Small Spaces, Ollie's class has been on a field trip to a Vermont dairy farm when their school bus breaks down in the woods, and the real world shifts into something eerie and menacing. She and 2 of her classmates escape the bus, but Ollie must lead them in figuring out what's going on, how to fight it, and how to save the other kids. In Race to the Sun, a journey into Navajo mythology, Nijoni and her 11-year-old brother Max seek the aid of the Diné Holy People after their father is kidnapped by a disguised monster. The siblings discover that they are descendants of Changing Woman and her sons, the Hero Twins, and that they have inherited their powers. Nijoni and Max must battle through terrifying ordeals in their quest to save their father, and they are helped by Nijoni's best friend, Davery, a brave and studious boy who finds much of the information they need. The Girl Who Drank the Moon is fully set in a fantasy world where dragons and witches are not the stereotypical creatures we often find in stories. Luna is a child who was left in the woods as an infant sacrifice. Each year, the city she was born into abandons its youngest child, supposedly as tribute to a witch who would otherwise destroy everyone in the city. In reality, the elders who take the child to the designated space use this ritual to hold on to their own absolute control of the inhabitants, and they assume that the infant will be eaten by animals. But there is a witch named Zan, and she rescues each year's baby and takes it to the free cities to be adopted by loving parents. On her journey with the child, she calls down starlight to feed it on the way. But in the year this story begins, she accidentally feeds the child moonlight and fills her with magic. Zan, the witch, lives in a cottage in the woods near a swamp monster named Glurk and a pocket-sized dragon named Firion. All three of them are devoted to Luna, and they educate her and care for her and give her a joyful childhood. But Zan can see that Luna has so much magic that it will be hard to control her. She's only 5 when she turns tree stumps into birds and Glurk into a bunny. And Zan has to create a spell to keep the magic inside Luna till she's 13. Most of the story takes place at the point where the magic is finally coming out, and Luna must learn to use it to overthrow the elders of the city and restore control to the people who live there. Now I'd like to take a closer look at the structure of these stories and the ways the main characters achieve their goals. Because of Winn-Dixie has a very simple structure. Opal tells the story in her own voice, chronologically in past tense. She and her father, the preacher, have recently moved from one Florida town to another, and they live in a trailer park that doesn't permit children. A quiet child, she's the only exception to that rule, so she lacks the chance to find friends her age. One day, her father sends her to the local Winn-Dixie for a few groceries, and there's a large, ugly stray dog knocking things over inside. The manager threatens to send him to the pound, and Opal can't stand the thought, so she tells him the dog is hers. She cleans him up and convinces her father that the dog deserves a home. And from then on, Winn-Dixie gives her the spirit to make connections. First, Opal and Winn-Dixie strike up a friendship with the elderly town librarian, who has few people to talk to. Winn-Dixie needs a collar and a leash, so Opal asks the clerk in the local pet store if she can dust and sweep the store to earn enough to buy them. And she makes another friend. She borrows library books to read to a woman who can't see well. Each new friend leads her to another lonely person, and by the end of the book, she and the others, old and young, have an outdoor potluck party. They're an unlikely but delightful group, and they show Opal their love when Winn-Dixie runs away in a thunderstorm. At the end, all is well, and Opal is a happy part of the community. And though the dog is the catalyst, it's Opal's determination and generosity of spirit that leads her to her goal. Race to the Sun is told in first person, present tense, by Najoni, the main character. It's a much more complicated story, taking place in the Begay children's town and school in the beginning, and then moving from the Albuquerque train station into a world where their train car goes straight up a mountain and leaves them and Davery in a world of rainbow roads and rock crystal guardians and massive birds and wild battles. Still told in the same sequential form. In this story, Najoni, whose initial goal is to do something heroic at school and be applauded for it, must use her brain to figure out how to overcome the challenges that face her. And she must use her archery skills to vanquish the monsters that intend to kill her and force her brother to use his water skills to damage the environment. Hardest of all, she must sacrifice her personal desire to be a hero before she can earn the right to do battle. At the end of the book, the 3 children are back in the real world, The Begay children's father is safe, and their mother is found and reunited with her family. Small Spaces is another book that moves chronologically from start to finish, and it also starts and ends in the real world, with the main part of the book taking place in a dangerous fantasy setting. It's told in past tense and third-person point of view through the main character, 11-year-old Olivia Adler. Ollie's goal at the beginning is simply to protect her emotions by avoiding other people. Her loving mother, a math professor, died in a plane crash the year before, and in her grief, Ollie's given up the athletics and chess club activities she loved and has distanced herself from the other kids at school. Her father is a great parent, but he's grieving too. On Ollie's way home from school one day, she rides her bike to an isolated swimming hole and finds a sobbing woman about to throw a small black book into the water. The woman says she made a bargain and she has to give the book to the water. Ollie ends up saving the book and riding home, where she discovers that the book was published in 1895 and is about the family that lived on the farm her class will be visiting the next week. When the school bus, she and her classmates, Brian and Coco, have to search for a small space to hide in. Much of what she's read helps her figure out how to escape the attacking scarecrows and outwitting the smiling man who would trap her in one of his bargains forever. She's also helped by directions that appear on her mother's broken watch, which she always wears, and by her own quick and careful thinking. Wonder's structure is more complex. Augie, who has been homeschooled until now, is about to begin 5th grade surrounded by other children. And his goal is to find a place for himself in the school. The story is told chronologically, but it's in 8 parts, and each part has its own first-person, past tense narrator. Augie tells parts 1, 6, and 8, allowing him to introduce himself and how he feels at the beginning, to add an important event midway that changes the way the kids at school see him, and to show how he's changed by the end. His older sister, Via, offers insight into the family dynamics in part 2. His first school friend, Summer, narrates part 3. His uneasy friend, Jack, explains his feelings in part 4. And Via's new boyfriend, Justin, gives a sympathetic stranger's reactions in part 5. Part 7 gives us the insights and kindness of Via's old friend, Miranda. This multi-narrator structure gives us insights and works well because all people who see Augie react, often with visible shock and also with reluctance to come close to him. He has a genetic condition of bone abnormality, which in spite of 27 corrective surgeries so far, leaves him with underdeveloped facial bones, malformed ears and mouth, and eyes placed lower than normal. It's a face that the kids at school describe as a zombie mask. As you can imagine, Augie has many painful setbacks on his way to achieving his goal of fitting in, but he's very bright and very determined, and he makes it. The structure of The Girl Who Drank the Moon is still more complicated. Luna's goal is to use her magic to save Zan and to defeat the evil powers that control the protectorate. But she only realizes this late in the story. Chapters 1, 4, 12, 20, 22, 29, and 48 are just 2 or 3 pages long and set in italics. Luna herself tells the dragon a brief story in chapter 20, but the other 7 italicized chapters are told in first person by a mother who was forced to give up her baby years before. These chapters are depressed and despairing until the last one, which is also the last chapter in the book. In it, the mother's attitude has changed to joy because she now knows the witch saved her son, and he's alive and happy. The other chapters in the book use past tense and omniscient point of view, and they focus on various characters who are often named in the chapter titles. A character's story may move along for a chapter or two, and then be interrupted by focus on a different character in a different time. Overall, this structure gives an extensive picture of the situation and of the ways various characters affect the possibility that Luna will succeed. As you can see, the subjects dealt with in middle grade fiction don't need to be simple or painless. The books I've described expose their readers to loneliness, physical pain, abandonment, death of a parent, rejection because of physical appearance, fear, oppression, and other disturbing experiences. Though the readers are young, these books treat them as sensitive, intelligent beings whose horizons will be expanded by what they've read. One important way contemporary middle grade fiction is expanding readers' horizons is through the consistent movement toward writing about children who would have been unlikely to fill important roles in earlier books. Wonder, featuring a child with disabilities, has been in the top 10 children's titles on the New York Times bestsellers list for more than 5 years. And rapidly growing numbers of books feature children from cultures or ethnicities that have not been frequently represented in the past. This movement matters enormously because it both familiarizes young readers with the multiplicity of cultures in the world, and because it gives members of those cultures a chance to read about children who look like them and may share some customs or traditions. In the books mentioned here, Brian, who became Ollie's good friend in Small Spaces, is Black. Augie's mother in Wonder is Brazilian. His father's parents were Jewish immigrants from Russia and Poland. Augie doesn't identify the kids in his New York City middle school racially, but some of them have Hispanic or Asian first names. The Girl Who Drank the Moon doesn't take place in the ordinary world, but Luna is described as having amber skin. Race to the Sun is a story about Navajo people and mythology. And the Joni and Mac's friend Davery, who comes with them on their quest, has a Navajo father and African-American mother. In this context, I'd like to mention Rick Riordan Presents, an imprint of Disney Hyperion begun in 2016 and overseen by Riordan, a very popular author of middle grade and young adult novels based on Greek mythology. Riordan saw the need for stories based on other mythologies, but he didn't believe he was the person to write them. So he sought out writers with ties to those cultures. And in 2018, he published the first of these books, Aru Shah and the End of Time by Roshani Chokshi, a book based in Hindu mythology. There are now at least 15 published titles based in Hindu, Maya and Aztec, Korean, Cuban, African American and West African, Mexican, Navajo, and Mesopotamian mythologies. Besides Race to the Sun, I've read Aru Shah and the End of Time and Paula Santiago and the River of Tears. Like Race to the Sun, both books have strong characters, captivating mythological worlds, humor based on the perspectives of the children involved, and absorbing action. From that sample, I'd say that the other books are probably equally appealing. And since I've finished now what I have to say about middle grade fiction, this seems like a good place to take a break for questions.
Thank you, Judy. And Judy, I just want to pass on that I'm getting some feedback that the mic is picking up your papers.
Oh, okay.
So just maybe pull those off of your laptop. Thank you. And we do have some time here for questions. You can type in the Q&A or in the chat. So Judy, it sounds like you talked about there are a lot of different ways to structure a middle grade novel. Is any preferred, or are there just different ways, those different novels that you presented?
I don't think there's really any preferred way, because all of these different ways, I mean, I wanted to show you some of the differences. It's hardly a beginning for all the different ways they might be structured. But it depends, I think, on the story. In the first story, for instance, the name of which I cannot even think about at this moment. But in the first story, the girl is trying to just become a part of the community, is just to find friends. And it's a very simple structure, but it's a very simple goal. And so it works. In the story of Wonder, where you have the boy with the disability, part of the story, a huge part of the story, is how other people take him in rather than just what he's trying to do. And so a more complicated structure is a better choice for a story like that. So I think really it depends on what you're trying to show in the story you're writing, whether the structure is complicated or simple.
Great. When did the publishing industry start designating middle grade and YA categories?
When did they start designating them as what?
As middle grade and YA categories. For example, would Huckleberry Finn and To Kill a Mockingbird have been marketed as middle grade fiction had that category existed at that time?
I would think they probably would have been. The categories, I don't really know the exact year or time when the categories became designated that way, but children's literature was a much smaller category overall 60 years ago, let's say, 50 years ago. And now it's a huge category. And so, and children have, well, it's a different world that we live in. They have different things that they are able to do. And so it made sense, I suppose, for the publishing industry to break them down into separate categories. In fact, when you talk about children's, you're really talking about everything from preschool through 12 years old. But middle grade is the upper level of all of that.
Okay, I wondered about vocabulary. I heard you talking about content. Are there any vocabulary guidelines? For example, I know that there are, that schools sometimes give a score to a novel, to a children's novel, that, you know, they score the vocabulary. Is that anything that a writer of middle grade fiction needs to think about?
I'm not sure I quite heard what you asked.
Sorry, the vocabulary, the word choice and the difficulty of the words.
As far as vocabulary goes, I'm probably not the person to ask, because I really don't know. I know that there are books that describe or list vocabulary for various age groups. But I think that a rule of thumb is also that if a particular word is necessary, if you can't express something without using that word, then kids will look it up or they'll figure it out from the context.
Okay, in the case of a crossover book, like the example given is In the Shadow of the Wind, how is the decision made whether to market the book as YA or adult fiction? Do you have any idea about that?
I don't know enough about the publishing industry from the inside to know exactly how those decisions are made.
Yeah, and I'll just say there is a huge crossover of YA and adult right now. So I'm not really sure either. Probably it's has some, I don't know the answer, but I can try to find out and let you all know about that. Other questions about middle grade fiction, and let's see. Let's give you a minute. Okay, well, if you do think of some, we're going to keep going. I think Judy's going to be talking about writing for YA or teen now, but we can come back if we need to. So,
Sure.
shall we move on then?
Okay. All right, these are the young adult book titles that I'm going to be referring to. 36 Questions That Changed My Mind About You by Vicki Grant. One of Us is Lying by Karen M. McManus. The Hate You Give by Angie Thomas. Cinder by Marissa Meyer. And Legend Born by Tracy Dion. 36 Questions, The Hate You Give, and One of Us is Lying are all realistic novels. Legend Born moves back and forth between reality and fantasy. And Cinder is a retelling of Cinderella that mixes fantasy and science fiction. Home still matters in these books, but its function is different. And romance often takes over as the more dominant focus. In 36 Questions, 18-year-old Hildy volunteers to participate in a psychology experiment designed to figure out whether two strangers will develop a romantic relationship in the course of answering 36 specific questions while they're alone together. Hildy's using the experiment to try to divert her thoughts from her guilt over having innocently made a comment that opened a rift in her parents' marriage. Her initial goal is to protect her 12-year-old brother, Gabe, from the repercussions of that comment. 18-year-old Paul, with whom she answers the questions, is suffering his own guilt over feelings of responsibility for his mother's death. But it's the exchange of truths between Hildy and Paul that leads to a positive future. And Hildy is the one who pushes that interchange forward when it seems to have hit a permanent end. In One of Us is Lying, high school senior Bronwyn Rojas lives in a loving and protective home, but she and 3 of her classmates are suspects in the death of a 5th senior who wrote a humiliating weekly gossip app and had a fatal allergic reaction during their detention session. Bronwyn's initial goal is to hide the secret Simon Keller might have known and to avoid being charged with murder. But when Nate McCauley, whom she's coming to care for, is the one charged, she forgets about her own problems and does everything she can to clear his name. The third realistic book, The Hate You Give, opens with the most painful problem. 16-year-old Star Carter's home is loving and attentive, but in the midst of a high-risk neighborhood. On the way home from a party, the friend she's riding with is stopped by the police for a broken taillight and ends up shot to death in front of her. Star and Khalil are black. The police officer is white. Star wants to tell the world what happened, but she's afraid of what notoriety may mean for her life, both in the neighborhood and in the private school she goes to. So she and her parents keep her presence secret. But guilt over not vindicating her dead friend, violence in the neighborhood, and problems with a gang bring her to the point where her goal instead becomes proclaiming the truth of what happened in every way she can. Romance is part of this story too, and the complications of her having a white boyfriend are an important part of the book. Cinder is a fantasy and science fiction mixture of Cinderella that takes place in the future capital city of New Beijing during a highly transmissible plague. Lynn Cinder is a 16-year-old cyborg, a human surgically altered by mechanical parts and the addition of biofeedback that gives her enhanced senses and the ability to read the internet through her brain. The stepfather who adopted her is dead, and her stepmother is both cruel and greedy, depending on Cinder's mechanical skills to support her and her two daughters, but treating Cinder like a worthless and disgusting creature. Because of her situation, Cinder's main goal is to escape. Early in the story, Prince Kai comes to her stall in the market and asks her to fix an android. The meeting begins a friendship between them that he appears to want to explore further. She's attracted to him, but she doesn't want him to find out that she's a cyborg. Cinder is unable to carry out her escape, but new information about her background leads her to a different direction in the end. Legendborn, a book that intermingles reality and fantasy, introduces Bree Matthews, a 16-year-old girl who has just begun a residential program for bright high school students at the University of North Carolina, her late mother's alma mater. Her initial goal, once she realizes she can see magical things most people can't see, is to discover whether her mother's recent auto accident was the hit and run it was supposed to be. Bree is grieving deeply, but as she investigates the secret society related to the magic, she falls in love with one of the members. Bree fights her way to reaching her goal, only to discover another powerful goal ahead of her. Here, as in Cinder and The Hate You Give, romance is an important component, but it's not the most important. The main characters in these 5 books, like those in the middle grade books we looked at earlier, have serious problems that need to be solved. Again, the characters must solve the problems themselves. Since the protagonists in these books are a few years older than those in the middle grade books, they have more freedom of movement and different resources to call upon. And the structures of these books are often more complicated than those of the middle grade books. 36 Questions That Changed My Mind About You begins in past tense, close third person. But the beginning is in the point of view of a minor character, the psychology graduate student who oversees the experiment. The first chapter shows him discussing the experiment with Hildy, describing her, wincing at her clumsiness in his office, and being amused that she's carrying a tropical fish in a plastic bag. The second chapter switches to his interview with Paul, the 18-year-old boy she'll be paired with for the experiment, who only wants to be in it for the $40 it will pay. The structure discards this narrator on page 18 and moves to the questions themselves, simply announcing each question and its number and following with the exact words exchanged between Hildy and Paul, their comments laid out like dialogue in a play, until Paul leaves the room after announcing his need for a bathroom break in the midst of their discussion of question 9. At that point, Hildy switches to texting with her father about being late for dinner, and with her friends Max and Ju about her interest in Paul. When Paul comes back, they continue through question 14, ending the session when they argue and she cries. Paul's last 2 lines in the section are, "What's your problem? You on your period or something?" And after a pause, "Oh my God, did you just throw your fish at me?" The book continues in a clever mixture of chapters written in close third person from Hildy's point of view, more questions between Hildy and Paul, and drawings by Paul, who's an artist. The responses to the questions show their movement from prickly answers that deliberately avoid letting the other person become aware of their real problems, to the gradual dropping of their defenses and the realization that they can trust each other. This structure allows the reader to get to know Hildy well, to understand what's going on in her family, how determined she is to protect her brother Gabe, and how she's developing a serious interest in Paul. When Paul disappears because she inadvertently stands him up, she realizes how much he means to her and uses all her energy to find him. She's still doing what she can to protect Gabe and make home a better place for him. But her relationship with Paul becomes her greater goal. One of Us is Lying also has an unconventional structure. The mystery of who killed Simon Keller is presented in 3 parts. Simon Says, Hide and Seek, and Truth or Dare. A brief epilogue follows. That structure itself is common enough. What's unusual is that the book has 4 first-person narrators: Bronwyn Rojas, Nate McCauley, Addie Prentice, and Cooper Clay, all of them seniors at the high school, and the only other people in the detention classroom when Simon has his allergic reaction. Most of the chapters are told by 2 narrators successively, though there are occasional chapters with a single narrator. As each new narrator takes over, his or her name appears at the beginning of the section, along with the day of the week, date of the month, and time of day, so the reader always knows who's speaking and when. At first, each narrator appears to have equal weight, but it gradually becomes apparent that Bronwyn is the protagonist. And though the title suggests that just one of the students is lying, we learn that each of them is lying about something they don't want the world to know. They don't lie to the reader, however, and they all reveal their own secrets at some point in their narratives. However, knowing what they're lying about still leaves the reader wondering who killed Simon. By the time all 4 of them decide to trust each other, the reader has enough information to trust them too. They work hard together to find the truth, and Bronwyn convinces a member of a pro bono legal group to take Nate's case. In the course of finding out who killed Simon, Bronwyn, Addie, and Cooper find solutions to the problems they were hiding and become stronger people. Nate's trust in himself and in Bronwyn takes longer, but they come back together, and she looks forward to a happy relationship. The Hate You Give has a more conventional structure. The book is told in 5 parts. When it happens, 5 weeks after it, 8 weeks after it, 10 weeks after it, 13 weeks after it, the decision. Star Carter, the main character, tells the story of her friend Khalil's death and its aftermath in first-person tense and chronological order. But Star has two voices. Of course, all of us change what we say and how we say it, depending on who we're talking to. But 16-year-old Star actually lives in two different worlds. Home is Garden Heights, the poor Black neighborhood she lives in with her parents, Maverick and Lisa, her 8-year-old brother, Sakani, and, part of the time, her 17-year-old half-brother, Seven. The rest of the time, Seven lives with his half-sisters, Kenya and Lyric, his mother, Aisha, and her man, King, the leader of a gang called the King Lords. Star's mother, a nurse, wants to move her children out of this environment. Star's father wants them to be safe, but his small grocery is in the neighborhood, and he believes that it would be wrong for the family to desert the people they've always lived among. Star's other world is school. She and both of her brothers have always gone to Williamson, a gated private school in a much wealthier neighborhood nearly an hour from Garden Heights. Here she and Sakani and Seven are among the handful of Black students on the campus. When she arrives the morning after Officer 115 shot Khalil, she tells herself, "For at least 7 hours, I don't have to think about Khalil. I just have to be normal Star at normal Williamson and have a normal day. That means flipping the switch in my brain so I'm Williamson Star." Williamson Star doesn't use slang. If a rapper would say it, she doesn't say it, even if her white friends do. Slang makes them cool. Slang makes her hood. Williamson Star holds her tongue when people piss her off, so nobody will think she's the angry Black girl. Basically, Williamson Star doesn't give anybody a reason to call her ghetto. I can't stand myself for doing it, but I do it anyway. Star has friends at school, and her white boyfriend, Chris, is a good guy who truly cares for her. But she's always aware of hiding part of her personality. And in her neighborhood, she has the reverse problem. She doesn't fit there comfortably either. The situation she now finds herself in splits her in two. Telling no one but family that she was with Khalil when he was shot and painfully reliving the events of that night finally becomes more than she can bear. She speaks out in an interview on national media and testifies to the grand jury that determines whether the police officer should be indicted. Star and Chris and Seven are endangered by the riots that fill the neighborhood after the officer is cleared, but her experience has taught her to go on fighting for justice. Her romance with Chris continues, but her focus is on the crusade. Cinder is told in 4 books, titled simply by their numbers. The chapters within them are told in close third person through 3 different narrators. Around 2/3 of them are told through Cinder. The others are told through Prince Kai and Dr. Erland, allowing the reader to understand the prince's precarious position when he becomes emperor after his father dies of leishmaniasis, but he still needs to host the annual ball. The future world, eerily like our current one, is being attacked by a plague of this disease, which is laying waste to the world's population. Dr. Erland is in charge of the scientists searching for a cure. Though this future Earth is similar to ours, their moon is populated by a race of people called Lunars, whose queen, Lavanna, is determined to marry Prince Kai so that she can control his country and eventually all the nations of Earth. Lavanna is able to cast spells that alter people's beliefs and behaviors, and she is withholding the cure for the plague, while the Earth's scientists struggle to find a way to stop it. When Cinder's younger stepsister, Peony, catches leishmaniasis, Cinder's stepmother blames Cinder and volunteers her for the testing, which is likely to kill her. But Dr. Erland takes a special interest in Cinder, especially when she turns out to be immune to the disease, and he later gives her information about herself that changes everything. This fairy tale has similarities to the one it's based on, though Cinder's goal is to escape from her stepmother's house and the city of New Beijing to work as a mechanic somewhere else. In this version of the tale, Prince Kai is attracted to Cinder at her market stall, even though she's dirty and oil-stained from her work. She does block his view of her mechanical leg and foot, so he can't see that she's a cyborg. They meet again at the market and at Dr. Erland's office in the palace, and Kai invites her to come to the ball as his guest. She turns him down because she's planned her escape for that night while her stepsister and stepmother are away from the house. And she's also heard that he will be announcing his future marriage to Queen Lavanna. She interrupts her own plans after she receives a message from a girl somewhere in space, warning her about Queen Lavanna's plans to use Kai to put her in position to dominate the Earth. At the ball, she dances with the prince and tells him not to go forward with the marriage. But Lavanna tricks him into believing that Cinder's a dangerous spy from the moon and makes him lock her in the palace prison. There, Dr. Erland gives her information that changes everything and puts her in the brink of a new and dangerous adventure. Cinder is the first book in a series called The Lunar Chronicles, so this ending is really the beginning of her adventures with Red Riding Hood, Rapunzel, and Snow White. In Legendborn, the fantasy world repeatedly spills into the real world, and Brianna Matthews and her companions must constantly be alert for danger. 16-year-old Bree narrates the book in first person present, and it's told in chronological order. A brief prologue shows the hospital scene where Bree and her father learn that her mother has just died as a result of an automobile accident. Bree is especially shattered because she and her mother had quarreled over her applying to the early college program at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and now they won't be able to make up. And also because the policeman who tells them about her mother appears to Bree to be drenched in magic. The story, told in 4 parts, begins 3 months later, on her first night at the university. Still upset over the rift she can't heal with her mother, she goes to a quarry party where she sees a battle between a small monster and 2 of the other guests. But no one else can see the battle. And Selwyn, the boy who interrogated the creature before killing it, does something to Bree to make her forget what she saw. But it doesn't work. The memory returns. The next day, her dean assigns Nick Davis, a second-year student in her program, to be her mentor. And while they talk outside on campus, she sees green flames pulsing between 2 buildings. Nick's shocked that she can see the flames and tells her to run, but she stays and sees him kill a larger monster than the one she'd seen the night before. Nick, like Selwyn, belongs to the Order of the Round Table, a campus secret society that has existed since the Middle Ages, and he's a descendant of King Arthur. Members of the society, the Legendborns, work to protect humans, or once-borns, from the Shadowborn monsters that find their way into the world. Bree believes there's a connection between the shimmering magic she saw the night her mother died and whatever is going on now, and she convinces Nick to bring her into the society as his page. She also meets with a counselor who was a classmate of her mother's, and Patricia Hartwood uses root magic to connect Bree to her Black ancestors, a practice her mother followed but never told Bree about. When Patricia and Bree are inside the memory of a Black woman who had been brutally whipped, a healer calls up yellow mage flames to close the wounds. Patricia tells Bree, "This is the heart of rootcraft, protection from those who would harm us, and if they do, healing so that we can survive, resist, and thrive." Patricia can only feel the flames, and she's very surprised that Bree can see them. Bree talks to her about the legend-born healer, but Patricia is opposed to the order. She calls them blood crafters and says they don't borrow power from their ancestors, they steal it. Now Bree begins to realize that she has supernatural abilities from two conflicting ancestral strains. The story becomes far more complicated, though Bree's initial goal is realized. She does learn the truth of her mother's death, but she also learns that her ancestry will propel her into a new and astonishing quest. She and Nick continue their romance till he is kidnapped, and Bree is the one who must get him back. Legendborn, like Cinder, is the first portion of a longer narrative, and its sequel has not yet been published. Just as the middle grade books I talked about now include characters with more various ancestries and abilities, the young adult books do too. They also, of course, have content that would not appear in books for the younger group. In 36 Questions, one of Hildy's best friends, Max, is gay, and the other, Zhu, is Chinese. Bronwyn, in One of Us is Lying, has a Colombian father, Cooper is gay, and Nate has dealt drugs till just before the story begins. Addie's boyfriend, Jake, abuses her emotionally and physically. Cinder is a cyborg whose stepmother reviles her for her condition, and her favorite companion is an android. Her story is set in a future China. Star and her family in The Hate U Give are Black, and her best girlfriend is from Taipei. There's a great deal of violence in the book, beginning with her seeing Khalil being shot to death and then the police officer turning his gun on her. And in Legendborn, Bree and her counselor are Black. Her best friend is a girl whose family comes from Taiwan. Sarah's father is Venezuelan, and Greer is transgender. The book is filled with violence and gore, particularly in the many battles with the monsters. All of these books, in both age categories, also have many moments of humor and tenderness and generosity that balance the harsher elements of their stories. All of them reward their readers by drawing them into worlds and lives different from their own and offering them new and often surprising experiences. It's the work of the writer to offer this sort of immersion. Now, we all know that writing fiction is hard. You have to create a world and inhabit it with characters and their problems. It takes a great deal of time, and you have to draw it all from your imagination. Then you often have to back it up with research. But writing fiction also gives you moments of joy when those characters begin to move and speak, when your brain gives you the answer to the insurmountable problem you've been struggling with for days, when a member of your writing group laughs out loud at a scene. Publication would be a joy too, but even without it, writing for tweens and teens is profoundly rewarding work.